Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a new week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is a Monday. It is the 11th day of July in the year 2016, and it is a pleasure to be with you at the start of this new week. Those of you who listen regularly know that we were not able to do a live program on Wednesday last. So the last time that we were together live was last Tuesday, but I think the day off Wednesday was, I was going to say planned. At least it was announced. It wasn't a last minute thing at all. So I hope that that everybody has been well. I do want to return to what we were into in our last program, the last time we were live, which was last Tuesday. But before that, I want to get into some contemporary issues, news of the day also. It's a pleasure to be with you at the beginning of yet another week here at the Virtual Center in the middle of the summer in the year 2016. I know that the weather has been an issue in a number of different places. I know that there are deniers out there about climate change, and they continue to be there. But the fact of the matter is the nation or portions of the world, not just the nation, are reeling. I was noticing this typhoon that was bearing down on Taiwan, and I was a little bit concerned about our friend Horst over there. And we had a situation here on Friday, because we don't broadcast live on Friday anyway, but we had a situation in southern West Virginia here, right in the county, the Raleigh County where Beckley is, and it was severe. Power was out. Thousands of people were without power Friday night into Saturday, and as of last night, there were still a couple of thousand people in the area, in this immediate region, without power because the winds were so severe that it took down a number of trees. I know I spent a good portion of Saturday with a handsaw cutting up a big limb that fell in a tree in our backyard, and I had to cut it up into sizable pieces, and it's kind of piled up in the middle of the backyard. And I spent yesterday raking up the remnants of leaves and branches and everything else that was blown around. And it's not three houses from where I'm standing right now. A friend of mine, she's been a friend of mine for 25 years, who headed, before she retired, she headed the local children's museum here in the Beckley area, and she, her house was hit by a huge tree that fell down, and I didn't even know it. But on Saturday night, my wife and I went to an event, outdoor theater here in West Virginia, to see the Hatfields and McCoys, which we've seen before. But this time our granddaughter is in it, so we have a little bit more interest than we usually do. But as we were entering the theater, the person who was taking tickets, who's a good friend of mine, who also worked at the Children's Museum, informed me about Sandy and the fact that her house was destroyed. And her house is only, as I say, 3 houses down from where we are, behind where I am. And so my wife and I walked down there yesterday and looked at her damage, and it's amazing. I hope, and I don't know, I'm guessing that she got out all right. I know that apparently the fire department came in the middle of the night and rescued her because the tree that fell on the back of her home was immense. And it's really interesting because it's one of those, the trunk of which is too big around to put your hands and touch your fingers, as it were. It's probably 4 feet in diameter, probably about 3 feet actually. But it broke off and and came down on the back of her house. And the interesting thing is the trunk is totally hollow. It's all hollowed out. But at the same time, there was growth on the top. It should have been dying. And in other words, if there was some sign that the tree was dying, it could have been taken down. There was no way to know that it was totally rotten on the inside. But after it broke and fell, it's very clear that it was. So the trucks are down there today trying to cut it up and get it off her house. But it looks like the house might be not salvageable because it's that big a tree. But anyway, severe weather. And so the climate deniers, the deniers of climate change, the severity of the winds, the amount of rain, the situation with floods. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, my wife's home in an adjoining county from here was destroyed. And she's been dealing with FEMA and with small business on loans to pay to have the house taken down. Unfortunately for her, while the house was destroyed, it's still there. So she's going to have to pay to take it down. So not only does she lose the value of the house because it didn't have flood insurance on it, but she's going to have to take out a small business loan in order to take the house down, because it's a hazard still standing because the foundation has been pretty much washed away. So it's just kind of teetering there. And so she's been involved. In fact, we've both been involved through much of the weekend dealing with that. My wife is dealing with all the agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, and all the rest of it. And it's a nightmare. But again, it's not the only residence. It wasn't our primary residence. So consequently, everything we own was not lost. But a good deal of my wife's furniture was in that house, even though it was rented. It was pretty much half furnished with my wife's stuff, and all of that's gone. So I don't know. It's going to be a hit for her, and most of my time has been spent trying to keep her together, if that makes sense. So it's been pretty traumatic, and I know that it has been around the country, and so for me, spending a couple of hours here at the virtual center is a sense of security and balance. I come into the little studio we have here, a combination den and studio, close the door, and I'm in my own little world here, just me and the other characters who from the 18th century who mull around my studio and my den, as it were, and we. For 2 hours, the outside world is pretty much non-existent while we're together here at the virtual center. So I just relish the time that we spent together, and I hope that you find it equally satisfying and hopefully beneficial as well. We would love to hear from you on issues of the day, and there are a number of issues, and I'm going to get into probably the most sensitive issue of all in the last few days here at the beginning of our program today. But before I do that, I'd like to make sure that you have our phone number and my email address and the instructions on accessing our Facebook page so that you'll know how you can participate even more actively in this program than merely listening to it. When Agnes introduced us today, she talked about this being an ongoing discussion. We're going to be talking at the beginning of the program today about the issue of race in America. And so if there's an issue that really absolutely demands some discussion, it's that one. So, and again, I'm sorry, I hope I don't have any revolutionary new insights. I think most of what I would say are things that I've probably said one way or the other before, and many of you have probably heard them and probably will have heard them put much more gracefully and much more succinctly than I'll do it. But in essence, it's such an important issue, and it relates directly to what we're talking about here at the Virtual Center. So I want to do that. But before that, as I say, I want to make sure that you have the information you need to access the program. If there's something that occurs to you that you would like to share immediately with us, then by all means, we invite you to get on the air with us and share, not only with me, but with our other listeners, your insights, your ideas, your comments, or whatever. For that, we have a phone number. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as you know, 4676 on your phone keypad translates into HORN. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me, and of course, if we're dealing with race, the racial issue, then it may be that you'll be a little bit reluctant to get on the air. I don't know. But on the other hand, if you have something to say, we sure would love to hear it. And so if you'd like to say it to me in an email, by all means, please feel free to do that. My email address is WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. WAObrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. And lastly, I want to make reference to our Facebook page. Facebook, many of you use. And as you know, about 6 months ago, we put up a Facebook page here for the Virtual Center. To access it, all you need to do is go to the homepage for Facebook, which is facebook.com. And at the search box, in the search box at the top, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be onto our Facebook page. And then if you scroll down, you will see the various postings that are there, the most recent one first. And I did post a couple of things over the last few days, I believe. And to tell you the truth, I've done so much posting on Facebook of late that I can't remember exactly, what I put on there when, as it were. Because yesterday, for example, I shared 3 or 4 different links on things that I had read on our Facebook page, and I posted them. So if you would access our Facebook page, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be there. And there are opportunities galore for you to comment and offer your thoughts on what's there. The postings, for the most part, are extremely opinion-focused. They're opinionated. They're my particular reaction or opinion to a particular issue that is going on. And if possible, I'll try to relate it with some historical evidence, if I can, or substance, or whatever. So, by all means, you are invited to comment. If you would like to pick up the phone and use our phone number and go on the air and share your thoughts with all of our listeners, we would welcome that. But I do believe that the Facebook page also gives you an opportunity to comment directly on it. There is also the opportunity there to message me directly on Facebook, or you can email me with my email address, waobrien906 @gmail.com. There are a number of ways that you can access Facebook. And to be very honest with you, and I don't want to get into this too much because I really can't at this point, because I don't know all that much, but an interesting thing occurred this morning, actually, for me. And I wanted to share it with you because my reaction was pretty immediate. Of course, one of the things I think we need to reference at the beginning of our program today are the horrendous outbursts of violence, gun violence, that occurred here in the United States, in our nation over the last several days. The 2 shootings of unarmed blacks, the first one in Baton Rouge, Louisiana last week, about a week ago, the second one in St. Paul, Minnesota, and then, of course, the horrendous attack on the Dallas Police Department that occurred this past Friday night. And the media is obviously full of this topic, of this subject, and it just seemed to me that it would be remiss here at the Virtual Center if we didn't devote at least a portion of our time to this particular issue. I kind of suspect that Bob Kincaid will be addressing these issues as well when he does his regular program this evening, as I'm sure that he did in his programming at the end of last week as well. These are issues that are so sensitive and so important that it seems to me one would have to really go out of their way to not address them if we claim to be at all up to date and at all current and relevant to what's going on in our contemporary world. It seems to me there are certain issues and certain events that we really can't ignore, and it seems to me these fall into that particular category. So that's kind of where I would like to begin today. Obviously, it seems to me that this is not a diversion or a side issue from the issue we were dealing with. And in fact, just before we went on the air, Agnes made this point. I happened to mention that I was going to get into this race issue a little bit, and her immediate reaction is how directly it tied to what we were talking about, which was Jefferson's idea of the moral sense. And indeed, she's right on. And that's why, and of course, I felt very good about Agnes making that point, because it speaks to the relevance and the importance of what we're doing. We're focusing an awful lot of our attention on the past, but the extent to which the past helps us better understand and handle the present, it seems to me, is an adage that I've often used, because obviously my area throughout my professional life has been history, and I feel this very, very strongly, and I felt it for a long time. And consequently, and wherever I could make the point, I tried to make that point, that the value of history goes way beyond the this and that's and this followed that and one damn thing after the other and all of these negative comments that people make about the study of history. It seems to me that if one really focuses on, really understands, or makes an effort to understand the past, one can learn an awful lot about the present as well, because it really gives us the signposts or points out some of the issues all of us need to focus on in order to understand the present. One of the things we were dealing with, and we will be back to that probably toward, later in today's program, and definitely if not today's program, then we'll be back to it tomorrow, is Jefferson's issue of the moral sense. And the basic idea that Jefferson, I was going to say idea that he had. It's not an idea that he had. It's basically his whole education, his whole being was grounded academically in the basic idea and reality of the moral sense. In fact, one of the things we've considered in our recent programs is the fact that Jefferson believed that the existence of the moral sense in all human beings was the key issue that linked all of humanity together. It separated mankind from all others of God's creatures. It was the defining factor that separated human beings from all other living things. Jefferson believed in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. One of the things we've realized is that the equality that Jefferson articulated in the Declaration of Independence is based on the existence of the moral sense. It's in all of us. He makes the point, not just in adult males, not just in wealthy adult males, not just in well-educated adult males, but in every human being, men, women, whatever their race, whatever their religion, whatever their creed, whatever their nationality, whatever their color. It's the basis of humanity. And it seems to me to be something that we have lost. And there's absolutely no question that as we sit in absolute stupor and watch the events of occurring here in our own nation in the last several days. And at the same time, we see a continuation of the violence around the world, much of it attributed or linked to ISIS, so-called. We are horrified at the inhumanity and the brutality of those animals over there who are trying to bring their violence over here. But the fact of the matter is, we're dealing with human beings. Jefferson said that. Jefferson believed that in his idea of the moral sense. He believed that it's the one thing that made all people somewhat equal. Jefferson also believed that the moral sense, and this was a quote that we looked at, the moral sense, like arms and legs, can be strengthened through exercise. In other words, we are not stuck with the level of the moral sense, the level of humanity that we are born with. But in fact, Jefferson believed it's possible to develop that. It's possible to expand it if we choose to. I would suggest to you that one of the real issues that seems to color man's history in recent centuries is the extent to which we have been, for the most part, reluctant or unwilling to emphasize this aspect of man's existence. Rather, we have spent most of our time focusing on the things that distinguish one from the other, what separates us, the issue of cultural advantage. When we're talking about nations, we have people that focus on the issues associated with the term American exceptionalism. We believe that our culture is superior to everybody else's, that our history is, that our leaders are, our Constitution is, our economy is. Excuse me for the phone in the background. It's the home phone, and I can't do anything about it. But the point is that we have spent most of our time focusing on what makes us better than others. And the reality is the others have spent time believing and working on exactly the same thing. And as yet, nobody has decided to go a totally different route. To, as Covey says, Stephen Covey says, I believe it's Stephen Covey, to take the road less traveled, to take the road that would lead us to places that for one reason or another we have chosen not to go. One of the things that has bothered me, and I think I've made this clear in recent programs dealing not only with Jefferson, but with Madison, Hamilton, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, the origins of the Constitution, and many other things, is the relative ignorance that seems to define what we know and what we don't know. Because the fact of the matter is, if there was history and it was there for all of us to study, to try to understand and try to learn from, that in itself would be something worth our focus, worth our time. But there's another issue which causes the whole thing to become blurry or muddy or confusing or unclear. And it's the fact that there are so many people, so many interests that have a vested interest in muddying the waters by confusing us, by telling us that history means something that it doesn't mean. In other words, they spend their time rewriting the past, retelling history's narrative to fit their own personal narrative, whether it be ideological, whether it be religious, whether it be racial, whether it be ideological or whatever. And the result is that if we aren't really protective, if we don't really honor and value the potential of history, if we don't know our own past, then we become vulnerable to those people who are more than willing to tell us what our past really is, remembering that what they tell us is aimed primarily at benefiting them, not us. Their job is to reinterpret the past in order to persuade us to support something or do something, or on the other side of the coin, to not support or not do something. And the fact of the matter is, how we come down on those particular issues tends to divide us politically and ideologically. It makes it impossible or less possible for us to form a united front on addressing the real issues that confront us. I believe, and I think I've made it very clear here in recent programs, I believe that Jefferson's moral sense, what the Scottish Enlightenment writers called, Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson and Lord Keynes and many of the others who wrote during this period, who were based in Scotland and studied the Enlightenment from this perspective. They believed that the moral sense was a key ingredient in understanding the world. And what makes it interesting is that this moral sense, this particular feature or facet of their understanding of the Enlightenment, doesn't make it onto the table with many of the other Western nations who are experiencing the Enlightenment for themselves, who are wrestling with the meaning and the implications of the scientific revolution, of the commercial revolution, and the political revolutions that are taking place throughout the developed world. It seems to me that one of the things, I haven't done the research, I don't have time to do this kind of research because this would be a monumental job. But it seems to me that there's every likelihood to believe that if one were to do the historical digging, one would be able to document the fact that part of the reason that other developed nations didn't buy into the idea of the moral sense is because it didn't fit their particular ideological worldview. It didn't fit in with what other things they wanted the world to be about. They wanted their people to believe. If their nation was very strongly religious, for example, then their priority would be to emphasize man's relationship for God as the source of morality and humanity. The implication being that the only people who could be moral would be religious people. And I don't think I would be far off the mark to say that many people in today's world continue to believe that. There are many people in this world, in this nation, who believe that this nation was primarily founded and created by Christians in order to be a Christian nation founded upon or based upon the Ten Commandments. This is what they choose to emphasize, and in doing it, they will rewrite the past in order to argue that. By definition, then, Jefferson's idea that man has within himself a moral sense, which gives him an innate ability to know right from wrong, good from bad, without anybody telling him what the answers are, is alien to the entire religious worldview that these people have. It would not be something that fits in. It would be something that would challenge the ideological goals, the religious goals of these people. Therefore, they would reject it. It is my belief that if one did the historical research, one would find evidence to suggest that this is the same kind of thing, kind of issue that was at the base of the foundation of the separation in different approaches toward the Enlightenment, toward attitudes toward the scientific revolution. Those with power and influence were able to take what the world, what man was discovering, and shape it into what suited them, and to eliminate those aspects of these findings that didn't. I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that the very same people who did this at the time of the Enlightenment are the kind of people today who deny climate change, who deny that man can pollute the environment, who even say that it would be arrogant for man to believe that he could screw up a universe that Almighty God created. Therefore, what's happening in climate must be natural, must be beyond man's ability to control. If we can't control it, if we can't change it, then it's arrogant to believe that we caused it. And so that fits perfectly into their ideological framework, the way that they look at issues. I think the world, I think our nation, I believe it, has chosen to ignore, to disregard, to repress, to dismiss, to reject outright those positions, those perspectives that don't fit their worldview, whatever it is. And when there are a number of people who support those particular positions, these people's reaction is not to reconsider them and take them more seriously. Usually their reaction is to dig in their heels and become even more stubborn and more adamant that they are right. The result being that we become divided on issues that could inform all of us if we could get beyond our own narrow sensitivities. I believe that. Consequently, since I think we could say as a generalization that overall it appears that man has spent as much, if not more time, emphasizing the things that divide us than he has spent emphasizing the things that unite us. One of the things that Jefferson pointed out, and it was really at the root of his mention of equality in the Declaration of Independence, is the idea that within every human being, irrespective of religion, color, race, whatever, there is a moral sense. There is a conscience. There is an innate sense of right and wrong, good and bad. People don't need to be told what it is because man naturally knows what it is. Societies have rejected the hell out of that. And I say that for emphasis, not to be negative or not to be a little bit off the way we should speak here. But I think there are too many folks who have a vested interest in people not believing in the idea of a moral sense, and especially not believing that it can be developed, that it can be strengthened, that it can become so strong that it dominates human behavior, rather than sits in the background overwhelmed by behavior that is controlled by others. By definition, organized societies create man-made institutions, the family, governments, economies, education systems, religious systems, and all the subcategories that fall under all of those. The family, the way that members of the family look upon each other, the way that husbands treat wives, the way that wives treat husbands, the way parents treat children, the way children treat in-laws, and all the rest of it. It seems to me, just to jump into something that's very contemporary right here, at the bottom line, at the base, the very foundation of this movement that is called Black Lives Matter, think about it for a moment. Those people that are asserting that Black Lives Matter do so because there's so much in our day-to-day existence that tells them that Black lives don't matter. I would suggest to you that I could have done the same thing with senior citizens. It seems to me that we could come out and say old people matter, the elderly matter, senior citizens matter, experience matters, the wisdom of knowledge and the years of life and what people have learned by being on this earth for so many decades matters. If we would choose to respect it, if we would choose to value it. So it seems to me, for example, that Rudy Giuliani's appearance on the morning talk shows Sunday morning on Face the Nation, I believe, when he insisted that Black Lives Matter, the very title, is racist, by asserting that all lives matter. Of course all lives matter. But the question is, does anything in Rudy Giuliani's background or ideological priority list seem to indicate that he really believes that? Or is his insistence that Black Lives Matter is racist and that really all lives matter is merely a way of dismissing or rejecting the Black Lives Matter movement issues? If Rudy Giuliani really believed and acted according to the idea that all lives matter, he would be here with us. He would be talking about this idea of the moral sense, this idea of an innate sense of good and bad. When Jefferson applied his brilliant mind to this issue, he basically had to conclude that it was the basis of all human equality. In spite of all the things that divided man, the thing that most united man was this innate sense of goodness, of morality, this idea of conscience, this idea that man, left free to pursue it, knows what's right, knows what he should do. But his day-to-day existence is filled with too many things that repress his ability to do what he should do. It's really interesting, because if you think back a couple of months to programs we've done here at the Virtual Center, when we get into Madison and some of the Federalist Papers and some of the letters that James Madison wrote, he pretty much believed the same thing. Madison talked numerous places about the difference between man's behavior when he's alone, as Madison says, in the privacy of his own closet, and when he's in company, in company with others. Madison's issue, of course, was factions. And when Madison Madison points out that when man is interacting with others, it comes naturally to him to link up with others who agree with him on issues that matter to them. In other words, factions are natural, he said in Federalist number 10. They are sown into the nature of man. But Madison recognized that what man's public face, public positions on issues are, doesn't necessarily always define what they really believe. Madison believed that in the privacy of their own closet, man would know what he should do and what he shouldn't do. That he wouldn't be playing to an audience. He wouldn't be subject to the so-called groupthink or group mentality, herd mentality, pack mentality, whatever you want to call it, that causes many of us to do what we do. We saw this in the riots these past several days. The protest movements. Many other people are there because they want to be, they feel like they should be there because other people whose friendship they value are there. They feel it's the right thing to be. Some of them are there for just the thrill of being involved. Some of them are there to cause trouble, to cause some action, some excitement. But the fact of the matter is, there are so many factors that affect what man does when man is exposed to others. But when he's all alone, when the cameras are gone, when the microphones are gone, when the crowds are gone, when the door to your den or your study or your bedroom or your closet is closed, and it's just you all alone, how you feel on issues frequently changes. Madison knew that. He also knew that we couldn't depend on this moral sense within man. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that Madison believed very much what Jefferson believed. That this sense of conscience exists in all of us. We are not what John Locke preached in his essay on human understanding, that man is what man experiences, that man comes into this world as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and that everything he becomes, all man's behavior and knowledge, is determined by what he experiences, by what he's exposed to. Madison and Jefferson, they didn't believe that. They believed that there was this innate sense of conscience within every person. Jefferson's belief is that you can strengthen it. You can so strengthen it that it dominates. It becomes the dominant factor that controls human behavior. And that's what Jefferson believed education was about. That's why he believed at all levels, everybody had to be exposed to education. Education was the only thing that could strengthen the moral sense within man. It's the basis of Republican government. It's the basis of their faith that man can govern himself. Madison made the point in one of the Federalist Papers, and I couldn't give you the number now because it would be incorrect, probably. But you will recall that Madison made the point in one of the Federalist Papers that if this isn't true, if we're wrong about man's ability to govern himself, if Republican government can't work, Madison said in the Federalist paper, then the Constitution of the United States should be rejected. It should not be ratified. Because the Constitution of the United States is based on the principle that man can be educated and man can learn. His moral sense, his sense of character, his sense of honesty, his sense of his desire to do for his fellow man. All of these things can be developed, can be strengthened. Jefferson even said the way to do it is with good books. Don't allow people who have an agenda to use what's called education as a way to manipulate you into doing what they want you to do. Jefferson believed that if you read good books, if you thought, if you engaged, if you opened up your mind and let your mind lead you where it can lead you, your mind would tell you that what your heart wants to do is what indeed you should do. And Madison said, and I know he believed, that when you're alone, when there's nobody else around, you know that's true. We know that's true. I mentioned, and we started to look at this article, and we will return to it, although it may not be today. This article called The Diffusion of Light, which is a study of Jefferson's philosophy of education, written by M. Andrew Holochak, who's a philosophy professor at Rutgers University. But even though we'll return to it later because I think there's so much good stuff in it, let me share with you what Holochak says in his introductory paragraphs to his article. In fact, this is the very first paragraph, the opening paragraph of his article. Let me share it with you. Thomas Jefferson's vision of republicanism was critically dependent on a democratic and meritocratic vision of education. Education for the general citizenry and higher education for those who would govern. So what he's saying is what we've said. It seems like within Jefferson, there's two kinds of education. One for the leaders, the people who will govern, and one for the followers who need to be taught to follow those who govern. On the assumption is they're more qualified and capable to be governing than they are. And then he quotes Jefferson, and this is a quote that we've heard before. Quote, "Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories. And to render them safe, their minds must be improved to a certain degree," unquote. That's Jefferson's statement of the need for education for everybody. And then Holochak makes the following statement, which is the reason that I'm sharing this opening paragraph with you. This is not a general Rousseauian view of the natural goodness of all persons, but instead a general observation, Holochak says. Driven by scrutinizing history and prodded by reading works such as Kame's Essays on the Principles of Morality and Natural Religion, and Destutt de Tracy's commentary on the Spirit of Montesquieu, quote, that a structure must be put in place to guarantee, insofar as such things can be guaranteed, that natural rights will be preserved and that humans left alone can flourish, unquote. What I would like to suggest here is that if you read that paragraph, the opening paragraph of this extensive study on Jefferson's philosophy of education, it's very obvious from the first paragraph that Holochak has an agenda. His agenda is to examine Jefferson's philosophy of education. But there's more. Not just to study it, but study it in order to show how it supports his particular view of the world, of society, of government, of the economy, etc. Holochak, by saying this is not the general Rousseauian view of the natural goodness of all persons, what Holochak is saying to us is, I don't believe that all people are innately good. What that means is, if he doesn't believe all men are innately good, then I would suggest to you he has left Jefferson at the very beginning of a study which is designed to inform us about Jefferson. He is telling us in his very first paragraph, my goal is to examine Jefferson's philosophy education in order to prove to you that Jefferson's idea of education is not Rousseauian, is not based on the idea that man is innately good. I would suggest to you that he can't prove that. In fact, I would suggest to you that there's a lot of evidence in Jefferson that he does indeed believe that man is innately good. He doesn't believe that everybody comes into this world with the same level of a moral sense. But he believes that everybody has it, and that it can be developed and it can be strengthened. But it can't be developed and strengthened if you teach people that everybody doesn't have it. Because if everybody has it, then mankind is potentially good. Everybody's good. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is, if everybody has it, and if it can be developed, which is what Jefferson says, then in reality, we come closer to Rousseau than we come closer to a rejection of Rousseau, if that makes sense. Because Rousseau believed in his social contract that mankind is innately born good, and that it's growing up in society and being taught what society wants us to believe that is man's problem. That if we could find a way to free human beings from the institutional controls and the political controls that society places on them, and allow the innate goodness within them to come forth, then many of the problems that we experience in the world, Rousseau believes, would disappear. And Rousseau believes that the whole idea of the social contract, the whole idea of governments being created by people for the purpose of governing themselves and holding governments accountable, is based on this belief that good things are possible unless blocked by those whose interest it is to prevent them from happening. But Holochek's first paragraph goes even further than that. Because what he's talking about is that a structure must be put into place. If it's going to be a structure, it's a man-made structure. If it's going to be a man-made structure, it has an agenda, it has a purpose, it has a desired outcome. If we create institutions in order to cause certain things to happen, the chances are what happens may not be necessarily consistent with what's innate within man. In other words, we're creating institutions to convince mankind that some things are true that they naturally, if indeed they could express themselves naturally, know not to be true. And what Holochek says, when he points out what this structure put into place to guarantee, as insofar as these things can be guaranteed, that natural rights will be preserved and that humans left alone can flourish. That's the model for free enterprise. That's a hint that Holochek's agenda is to use Jefferson's philosophy of education to support the idea of free enterprise, the idea of emphasizing individual freedom, the idea of taking one of Jefferson's inalienable rights, mainly liberty, and giving it a greater priority than the other unalienable rights that Jefferson mentions. So right away, in the very first paragraph, we begin to see that this study of Jefferson's philosophy of education really is going to be an effort to interpret Jefferson in a way which ends up making him a supporter of what you want to believe that he does and should support, because it's what you support. I believe that. So with just a minute or two left in our first hour, we're at 58 minutes after the hour, so we've almost completed our first hour and barely got warmed up yet, let me tell you. But I really think that the links between what Jefferson is telling us, the issues that we looked at in the Declaration last week to celebrate, last week in order to celebrate the 4th, a week ago Monday, a week ago today, are very relevant to some of the issues that are occurring in the world around us. And if we'll but look, I think they inform us. They give us insights into strategies, into ways we might proceed that we're not getting from the people who are invited to appear on the talk shows in order to tell us how to solve these problems. In essence, the networks created to give us the news have in part become agents to help make the news. And I think the Rudy Giuliani piece that referred to just a moment ago is an example of that. The Black Lives Matter issue as being racist, the very title, the very name, Black Lives Matter, to Giuliani is racist because all lives matter. If you really believe that, then there's more to it. There are obligations or responsibilities that go with that if you believe it. And so the question is, does Rudy Giuliani really believe it? Because when you look at his positions on many of these issues related to violence against the police and violence against African Americans, I don't hear a lot coming out of Rudy Giuliani's mouth that suggests anything that is consistent with his beliefs, professed belief that all lives matter. If you believe that all lives matter, then it seems to me that creates a whole litany of behaviors that you would necessarily have to adopt in order to be philosophically consistent. And I don't see it in Rudy Giuliani, and I didn't see it in that interview yesterday either. So let's think about this and pause, take our 5-minute break. I'm going to go freshen up my coffee during that 5 minutes, by the way. And when we come back, let's pursue this a little bit. Let's look at some of these issues and pursue this a little bit more, because I do believe that the past has an awful lot to tell us in how we can deal with the present that I honestly believe, and I think you would have to agree, that we're not handling all that well. The solutions that people are coming up with so far aren't working. Maybe we ought to go back to the drawing board and look at some of the things that those people whose wisdom and insights we've respected for so long. Let's see what they tell us on some of these issues. We'll pursue that when we come back after our break. We're right at the top of the hour now. It is 2 minutes after. We've just gone beyond the top of the hour. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back. Please stay with us. I hope you will. And thank you. We'll be right back. Thank you, Agnes. I had to put my microphone back down. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Monday, the 11th day of July in the year 2016. Thank you for joining us if you are just joining us. If you are, let me basically kind of bring you up to date very quickly. What we've been talking about is the linkage, if you will, between the present and the past, namely looking at the issues which are engulfing the nation and the world of late within the last week, dealing with the eruptions of violence, not only within this nation, but all over the world. And we'll be dealing with some of this here in our second hour. But linking it back to the founders, to Jefferson and his idea of the moral sense, which is where we kind of left off last week. So it's really kind of interesting. The link is there. And it seemed to me what these things do is indicate very clearly the extent to which the past has something to offer us in our ability to understand the present and suggest ways that we might indeed go about resolving it. And I guess part of the issue is maybe we haven't quite accepted that yet. We give all of this honor, we pay all of this homage to the founders for the brilliance of what they did, but we haven't quite been able to deal with the idea that what they are telling us is really what we need to do in order to solve our problems. And for a lot of very, very selfish reasons, I believe, we haven't done that. Not only haven't we done it, but we reject those who advocate it. We belittle, we dismiss, we reject, we ridicule those who suggest things that don't fit into our particular worldview, our particular game plan, what we choose to believe. And of course, when I say that, I realize that it's a contradiction in terms. Because most of us don't choose what to believe. We're taught what to believe. And there's no choice at all. It just is. And there's nothing else. That's what belief systems do. That's why Jefferson didn't want it anywhere near education. Because by definition, education is cognitive. Education is bringing our mind to bear on issues and events and theories and suggestions and philosophies and ideas. And by definition, if you bring your mind to bear on them, then you're probably going to end up finding out things that don't conform, that don't fit with what you believe going in. And the issue is how you deal with those. I think what we were talking about in our first hour is more often than not, those who are in positions of power, who are in positions to influence how we respond to some of these things, frequently choose to not only not accept them as being valid, but to find ways to repress them or hide them. Or if we can't hide them, then what we do is take to attacking, challenging the validity of the people who brought them to us. Jefferson, many times, is referred to as an idealist, as someone who's very impractical, who puts out ideas that he doesn't realize how impractical in the day-to-day world that we all live in many of these ideas are. I would suggest to you that these are the kinds of things which cause people to dismiss these ideas as being so impractical and so idealistic as to be impossible to implement, therefore not necessary to study. I was going to say we'll get back to this. I just wanted to give you the phone number and things, but let me hold that for 1 second if I can. This issue of rejecting ideas and rejecting those who bring those ideas to us. I think we see that numerous places in numerous kinds of ways. We've done this in the past, so this is not new. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it necessarily, but I think it illustrates what we're talking about. In the early 19th century, there was a movement in Western literature and Western philosophy, which, for lack of a better term, we refer to as Romanticism. Part of the reason that we call it Romanticism is because the ideas it puts forth are, in the eyes of many people, very romantic. In other words, very idealistic, not very down to earth. In many cases, not very possible, not very practical, but things that sound good. They are, wouldn't it be wonderful if kinds of things, but they aren't practical. They don't fit into our contemporary world. If you read poetry, for example, that those who put together anthologies of literature would call romantic poems, they are poems which deal with nature, with beauty, with love, with kindness, with concern one person for another. Very nice, good stories. It's kind of the literature version of the Hallmark Channel, of the Christmas movies on the Hallmark Channel. They aren't very realistic. They don't really happen. Life doesn't happen that way. But they always end positively. They always end with the couple finding each other. They always end where love wins out. They're delightful movies, even though in the minds of many of those people that watch them, they're fiction. It's not the way life really is. It's the way we wish life was. Well, damn it, let's think about this for a second. Maybe the reason that it's only life we wish it was, rather than life that really could be, is because so many different interested groups have convinced us that they can't be. That it is unrealistic. That it's pie in the sky. That it can't work that way. That people are so selfish and so self-interested that it would never work. The idea of people really caring about each other and putting concern for their neighbor ahead of themselves and all of these other, that's a dream. Oh yeah, it's in Matthew. But it's not real. That's not the scripture that most of us choose to abide by. The parts of scripture that we choose to focus on are the parts that emphasize retribution and getting even and an eye for an eye and all that stuff. Why? Because that's the world that those who are in a position to control it want us to believe is the only option. And the way you deal with people who suggest that there is another option is to belittle them, is to ridicule them, is to put them into the category of idealists, dreamers. And as we mentioned, it exists. If you read the Wordsworth poetry, for example, Wordsworth and many of the other romantic poets of the time, you begin to experience a world which is so delightful, but it can't really happen. The reason it can't really happen is because you've been taught to believe that it can't really happen. And what I'm suggesting is, if you can be taught to believe that it can't really happen, then damn it, you could be taught to believe that it could. It might. We could head in that direction. Let me go back to the theme of the first hour. If you did truly believe that within every human being there was the semblance of the beginnings or the makings of goodness, and you began to act accordingly, and you focused not on repressing that so that you could turn out people who were ready for the rough and tumble world that is the world that is, if you began to convince them that this more positive, idealistic world that exists within them might really be possible, and if that was universally accepted, then in essence, the world that is not even possible could become the world that might be possible to attain. In the United States, during this romantic period in the early 19th century, late 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there's a whole school of literature. We've dealt with this before. I'm not going to go into all of the details on it, but there's a whole school of literature primarily based in New England, that we refer to as transcendentalism. This is the stuff associated with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, and what that means, the symbolism of what that means. Thoreau's idea that the only way to discover this alternative world is to find a way to leave the world we're in, go into the woods, so to speak, and experience the world that God created, the nature that the Creator originally created, that hasn't been despoiled by what man would do, cutting down the trees, concreting everything. And the irony is hiring people to create an image of nature that is man-made. In other words, create concrete plazas that feature potted plants and flowers, which is an effort to bring the beauty of nature into the hardcore world of what is and where man lives. Mark Twain talked about this in Tom Sawyer. And there's a story in Tom Sawyer about peeping in the window at this beautiful bouquet of flowers sitting in the middle of the dining room table. And all the different colors, the bright reds and yellows and greens, and how beautiful they were. And immediately begin to speculate on what the aroma would be like, what they smell like. And lo and behold, when you do get a chance to experience the aroma of the flowers, you find out that they aren't real, that they're fake, they're imitation flowers. They look as pretty as nature's real ones, but there's no smell at all. How ironic that what we have done through crossbreeding and all the rest of it, we have developed flowers that have no aroma, no smells. Many of the times, if you go to many of these outlets and buy these plants, potted plants, that are beautiful, that have all the colors, but they don't have any aroma. And it's kind of interesting that we have done that. Anyway, I've mentioned this before. Emerson wrote a number of powerful essays, and I know many of you are familiar with these. Emerson's probably become my favorite. I find myself reading Emerson sometimes just to kind of reconnect with what I would like to believe the real world really is. And in one of Emerson's most moving essays on what he calls the oversoul, Emerson lays out the belief of transcendentalism about mankind, about humankind, what it is, what's happened, and what the answer is to what happened. This is one paragraph from one of the early paragraphs from Emerson's essay on the oversoul. If you've never read it, I would encourage you to do it. It's pretty powerful. Emerson says the supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present Let me repeat that. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present. The Creator. And the only prophet of that which must be is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. Emerson basically is saying that God's plan, nature's plan, is that everything is connected. Everything is related to everything else. There is a divine purpose, or and the word that is used today in totally different context, the idea of an intelligent design. Emerson believes that nature has a plan because nature comes from the Creator. And that plan is what Emerson calls unity. He calls it the oversoul, in which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. In other words, we're all connected. We're all human beings. In this sense, we are all the same. Kind of what Jefferson called the idea of the moral sense, the morality of the conscience, or the desire within us to do good and to love our neighbors, which is inherent in our very being. Emerson and transcendentalists generally buy into the same positive image. That common heart, Emerson says, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. Think of this. I mean, this is Emerson. I just love the way this man puts words together. To which all right action is submission. In other words, when we do what's right, when we do what we should do, not what someone tells us to do, not what we're taught we ought to do, not what best benefits us in what we do, but what we should do. What Madison said we would know in our own privacy of our own closets, we would know what to do. Emerson said, when we do that, we are in essence submitting to the divine plan. We are doing what the plan says we ought to do. We are reconnecting with the life that all of us have in common. Emerson goes on. That overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is and to speak from his character, not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. My heavens, what powerful language. What Emerson is saying is, when we allow the goodness within us to dictate what we are and what we do, then the divine plan begins to take shape. We are contributing to, rather than detracting from, nature's divine plan. What he is saying is that it is what he calls the overpowering reality that confutes our tricks and our talents. All the other things that we learn that are contrary to this overpowering reality are tricks, talents. Those things that constrain everyone to pass for what he is, to speak from his character, not from his tongue. To say what we feel rather than what's expected of us. The implication here is that what we hear isn't really what's real. It's doublespeak. It's what politicians do. And all of these things, Emerson says, when we do what's right, they pass into our thought and into our hand. They become wisdom, virtue, power, and beauty. In other words, all of these ideal things that we think aren't possible begin to become possible when we allow what's natural within us to come forth. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. In other words, we've been separated, we've been divided up into parts, and therefore lose sight of the entire entity. Meantime, Emerson says, within man is the soul of the whole. I would suggest to you that that soul of the whole, which Emerson calls the oversoul, is the moral sense that Emerson's predecessors in the 18th century wrote about and talked about. This soul of the whole, Emerson says, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one, capitalized, O-N-E. In other words, when these things happen, when these things come forth, the disconnected world we live in begins to come together. We begin to see how things relate, how things connect. I would suggest to you not to get off on a tangent here or change subjects. But this is what real education is about. The ability to connect. The ability to see connections. To understand how things relate one to another. I would suggest to you the education system that most of us have experienced is an educational system built from the division of things into facts, 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 as Gradgrind says in Charles Dickens's Hard Times. Education is not fact, 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 which you hammer into the head of a child and you demand that child regurgitate. And if he can do it, you define that as education. That is anti-education, it seems to me, in the context of this. Emerson goes on in this paragraph and says, and this deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is all accessible to us, is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. Let me suggest to you that that sentence is really the essence of Eastern philosophy. If you read the writings of Confucius, and you read Buddhism, and you read Hindu literature, for example, you will find that they talk all the time about how things connect, how subject and object are related, how things connect. The very famous example, or the very famous item of wisdom, which basically says, if you look into a creek or a brook or a river, you never see the same river twice. Think about that. If you dip your toe into a stream, and then you take the time to take it out and dip the other toe into that stream, it's not the same stream because it's moving. All things are connected, subject and object. And let me just make one point. Isn't that what Einstein talked about when he came up and used the term relativity? All things are relative. Science is catching up with this, but it's taking a while, especially because so many people reject it. So many people have a vested interest in dismissing it or in repudiating it, or worse, repudiating the people who bear it. We see the world, Emerson says, piece by piece, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree. But the whole, of which these are the shining parts, is the soul. There's a connection. There's something that links all of these things together. It's the soul of life. Only by the vision of that wisdom can the horoscope of the ages be read, and by falling back on our better thoughts, by yielding to the spirit of prophecy which is innate in every man, we can know what it saith. We can know if we look, if we will, but look. The sun, the moon, the animal. I ask you to think about what those who are anti-environmentalists come up with when they call environmentalists tree huggers. What does that say? It is saying we reject those who believe that trees are living things and that they are in any way connected to me, a human being. Because my God created me, I'm superior, and God put me in control of everything else that God created. It's all mine to use and do with as I will. Therefore, to link me with all of these other forms of life is to insult my God. I would suggest to you we have here the basis of the conflict between the thinking, the mind of Emerson, and the mind of those who refuse to even read him. So alien to everything people choose to believe is this passage from Emerson that most people refuse to read it. He's a dreamer. He's an idealist. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He most likely was on some sort of drugs, or he was an alcoholic, probably gay. In other words, everything you can do to repudiate what these people say, because what they say to us is threatening to all we choose to believe. What we do is we emphasize the parts. We emphasize the particles. We emphasize the divisions. We emphasize those things which make us different, not those things that make us one. I would suggest to you, and I don't know whether you'll hear this in a lot of other places, but I would suggest to you that much of the answer to the news all of us have wrestled with over the past several days lies in our ability, not in our ability as just a couple of people or a few people. I'm talking about the world. The answers lie in our ability to overcome those things that divide us and to put a priority on those things which unite us. Ironically, Rudy Giuliani had the answer. All people matter. But too few of us are willing to walk that walk. We talk the talk. But in Giuliani's case, talking the talk in that particular instance is a way to repudiate or reject Black Lives Matter. Because, ironically, Giuliani is right. Black Lives Matter rejects the concept of all life matters. But the fact of the matter is, the reason that there is a Black Lives Matter movement, the reason that one is necessary, is because organized society has refused to accept the reality of what all lives matter really means. The answer is to discover that. And it seems to me the reason it's the answer is because it supersedes religion. It rises above my God versus your God, and is basically built on the assumption that what we are talking about here is our God. The God that created all of us. The God that created all living things. The God that linked all these things together in what Emerson referred to as a soul. And what he calls, as the title of his essay, the oversoul. The overarching linkage that connects all life. It seems to me it's an ideal, it's a dream, it's not the real world, because we choose to make it that way. Let me give you an example. And for that example, I want to return briefly, because we don't have that much time left. We've got about 15 minutes left, a little bit more than that, in our time together today. We can pick this up again. We probably will. We'll definitely be back with Jefferson in future programs. But let me refer to this. This is an essay that appeared in the Washington Post on the 6th of July, which is last Wednesday. The author, George Will. I facetiously, and I don't mean this the way it sounds, but I was going to say my old buddy, George Will, because it seems like I go to him because he seems to say so well the things that I can't say nearly as well, because he believes them and I don't. I guess maybe that's the answer. But anyway, he is so popular and he speaks for so many people and is so influential. Last Wednesday, on the 6th of July, he wrote an essay on the social sciences. I read it. I caught my eye because obviously I'm quite familiar with the idea of the social sciences. And so when I saw that George Will had written a column in the Washington Post entitled "The Sobering Evidence of Social Science," I could not read it. This obviously came before the shooting in the massacre in Dallas. But it came after the shooting in Baton Rouge. The issue was race was on everybody's mind, on the tip of everybody's tongue. And at this time, George Will reminded us of the social science research from years ago that he believes lays out the reasons or the issues on which these kinds of violent incidents are based. Namely, the research of James Coleman in the 1960s in his monumental study, The Equality of Educational Opportunity. And it was followed, Coleman's study was followed by 1 year with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's monumental study on the breakdown of black families in America, the breakdown of two-parent homes, the raising of so many children born out of wedlock, so many children being raised without a man or a father in the home, and what that meant in terms of some of the racial issues that we were dealing with in society. George Will's point to bring the results of this research back on the table and suggest to us that we had the answers before, we just refused to accept them. And so basically, what George Will does is return to James Coleman's study. And let me share, for those of you who might remember the name of it, but not remember the details, let me share with you this paragraph from George Will's article. Enter Coleman, he says, and the colleagues he directed to puncture complacency with a dagger of evidence. Data from more than 3,000 schools and 600,000 primary and secondary school students. His report vindicated the axiom that social science cannot tell us what to do. It can tell us the results of what we are doing. Coleman found, George Will says, that the best predictor of a school's outcomes was the quality of the children's families, and student achievements were influenced by the social capital, habits, mores, educational ambitions their classmates bring to school. In other words, the reason there is black violence in America is because blacks have not accepted and bought into the institutional framework of white society. In other words, it's their fault that they are living the kinds of lives they live, and that does not legitimize or make credible the violence that they perpetrate on mainstream society, because they feel that they are not being treated equally. His point, if you are not being treated equally, it's your fault, not our fault. Because you have been raised, you live in a world which rejects the social and institutional framework which defines ours. Here's a quote from Coleman's report. One implication stands out above all, Coleman says, that schools bring little influence to bear on a child's achievement that is independent of his background and general social context, and that this very lack of an independent effect means that the inequalities imposed on children by their home, neighborhood, and peer environment are carried along to become the same inequalities with which they confront adult life at the end of school. And then 1 year later comes the Moynihan Report, leaked in July of 1865. Study on the Negro family, the case of national action, which made public for the first time the fact that 23.6% of African American births were to unmarried women. Today, Will reminds us, That 23.6% is now 71%. Almost 47% of all first births are to unmarried women, and a majority of all mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. In other words, the family's breaking down. The basis of our society is breaking down. It's broken down further and is more developed in black families than any other. And that's the reason why black children are not able to benefit from an education system that allows white children to benefit. And his criticism, of course, George Will's criticism, is that society's answer was to throw money at the problem. And his point is the problem is not related to the amount of money. It's related to the social baggage, if you will, or the social preparation that each child brings to school. Socializing these youngsters into society's urgent business is the way to solve it, according to George Will. The fact of the matter is, all of these things are not causes of racial tension and racial hatred in America. They are merely products of it. I asked George Will to go deeper. Why is it that there is a breakdown in black families? Why is it that the educational system fails African Americans? Why is it that they leave school without the skills necessary to get meaningful jobs? Why is it? Why is it? Why is it? I would suggest to you the bottom line is because there is this basic idea that these people must be made to integrate into our framework, our society, our institutions. There's no indication here that as human beings, we are all equal. And if there is a breakdown in black society, if there's a breakdown in the black family, and if that breakdown has all of these reverberations throughout society, then it speaks to the failure of all of us, not just them, not just that segment of society. It seems to me that the missing element here is the respect for the humanity of everybody. I would suggest that this translates beyond the borders of this nation and could be applied equally to the world at large. This is the kind of worldview, the kind of insight that the Pope tries to give us in the various encyclicals that we have seen coming out of the Vatican recently. The idea that we are all God's children. We are all one. We are all equal. We are all human beings. And the ultimate goal is to value each other and love each other, not to highlight the differences between each other and force one group to amalgamate into the institutional priorities of the other group. What we are talking about is a world in which all of these people from wherever are one and are respected by each and every one of us as the fact that we are all one. If we really believe that, if we really subscribe to it, then I would suggest to you that much more than racial tension and racial violence in this nation would end. It would not be logical. It would not be sensible to perpetuate wars and issues of nationalism and all of these other isms that divide rather than unite. Because all of them, the reason they divide is because they deny the kind of respect that is at the root of what being a human being is about. And I would suggest to you that's what education needs to be teaching us. Jefferson believed that. We'll see that in the next couple of days when we go into Jefferson's ideas on education, whether they be higher education or basic education. The basic ideas that speak to the reality of what he called the moral conscience. It's what makes us all one. It's the basis of all men being created equal in the mind of the person that wrote those words. And all of the other stuff that we hear about equal, Jefferson really meant equality of opportunity. Did he? Why didn't he say that? Not only that, but when he said it the way he did say it, the Congress of his colleagues bought into it without question, without debate. He must have been speaking for those of the time. What he was saying was self-evident truth. The irony of ironies is that in today's world, we just recently lost a prominent figure, Antonin Scalia, whose basic idea of constitutionality was to return to the original intent of the authors. Obviously, however, it seems that what the man really meant was, you go back to the intent of the authors if it fits the particular agenda that you currently have. If it doesn't, then you don't. I think we see that in Scalia's approach to the Second Amendment in the Heller decision. If the Second Amendment as written does not say what you want it to say, then you turn it around, you take one portion of it, and you basically write off the rest of it as fluff in order to make it say what you want it to say. I would suggest that this is the reality of what we're dealing with. I really believe, again, I'm not a preacher. I'm not trying to in any way tell anybody what the answers to issues or solutions to problems are or everything else. But I do believe that there's enough evidence in those who have lived before us to give us some insight on where we ought to go and what we ought to begin to do in order to begin to find solutions to these problems. I would suggest to you that the Constitution of the United States, as drafted by Madison and the other framers, was perfectly consistent with this approach to education, with this approach to Republican government. The idea that you get the best educated people in the nation in one room. You find a way to eliminate all the local pressures, all the things that tell them what they should do, and you turn educated people with no personal agendas loose to take on the national interest, to take on the common good or the public agenda. And Madison believed if we can do that, if everybody's on the same page and headed in the same direction, we can solve problems that we always believed mankind could not solve. I think that, in my mind, is the model that we do best to follow. We were at the end of our program. It's now 3, so I'm just going to say thank you and invite you back to tomorrow's program here at the Virtual Center. Remember, we'll be beginning 1/2 hour later tomorrow than today. In the East, our program will begin at 1:30 p.m. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.